The transport ship's engines roared as it touched down on the dusty landing pad of New Sol, sending clouds of red dirt swirling through the air. Colonists working nearby stopped what they were doing and stared as the massive figure emerged from the spacecraft. Vexthor stepped onto human soil for the first time, his 4 muscular arms stretching after the long journey through space. His body stood nearly 8 feet tall, covered in what looked like living crystal armor that shifted colors from deep blue to silver as he moved. Each step he took made the ground tremble slightly under his enormous weight. The Kelthani warrior had traveled across 3 star systems to reach this remote mining colony. His people were known throughout the galaxy as master swordsmen, and their empire had grown powerful by conquering world after world through single combat. When Kelthani warriors challenged a planet's greatest fighter and won, that world became part of their empire. It was an old tradition that had worked for hundreds of years. Vexthor had never lost a duel, and his 4 arms could wield blades with deadly precision that no 2-armed creature could match. As he walked through the settlement's main street, human colonists scattered like frightened animals. Children hid behind their parents, and shopkeepers quickly closed their doors. The alien's presence was overwhelming. His crystalline skin caught the sunlight and threw rainbow patterns across the buildings. His 4 eyes, arranged in pairs on either side of his angular head, scanned everything with cold intelligence. Most unsettling of all were the 4 ceremonial swords strapped to his back, each one crafted from materials that seemed to glow with inner fire. Vexthor stopped a trembling colonist, a middle-aged woman carrying groceries. His voice rumbled, like distant thunder when he spoke, the universal translator making his words understandable but keeping their alien tone. He demanded to know where he could find their greatest warrior, their master of the blade, the one who could represent humanity in honorable combat. The woman's hands shook as she pointed down the street toward a small building with steam rising from its windows. The warrior followed her directions and found himself standing before Kim's Noodle House, a modest restaurant that looked like it had seen better days. The paint was peeling, the sign was faded, and the whole place seemed to sag slightly. This couldn't be right. Where were the training grounds? Where were the weapons? Where were the students learning deadly combat techniques? Instead, he saw through the window an elderly human man moving slowly between tables, serving bowls of soup to customers who chatted quietly among themselves. Kim Tae was 73 years old, though the colonists would have guessed he was much older from his careful, measured movements. His hair had gone completely white, and deep lines marked his weathered face. He wore a simple apron over plain work clothes, nothing that suggested he was anything more than a humble restaurant owner. When the massive alien warrior entered his establishment, the other customers quickly paid their bills and left, but Kim Tae continued wiping down tables as if nothing unusual had happened. Vexthor announced himself with great ceremony, explaining that he was the greatest blade master of the Kelthani Empire, undefeated in 400 single combats across 12 conquered worlds. His voice filled the small restaurant as he spoke of honor, tradition, and the ancient ways of settling disputes between species. He had come to challenge Earth's greatest swordsman to determine whether humanity would join his empire willingly or be conquered by force. The old man listened patiently while continuing his work. When Vexthor finished his grand speech, Kim Tae simply nodded and suggested they meet at sunrise in the valley just outside town. There was a flat area there that would serve their purposes well. He said this in the same tone he might use to discuss the weather or suggest a good soup special. This response completely confused the alien warrior. He had expected either terror or fierce acceptance, battle cries or cowering submission. Instead, he got the kind of casual agreement someone might give when asked to meet for tea. Where was the warrior's pride? Where was the ritual preparation? Where were the declarations of honor and strength that preceded all proper duels? As Vexthor left the restaurant, he wondered if these humans truly understood what was at stake. Perhaps their greatest warrior was simply too old and weak to care about the outcome. Maybe this would be easier than he had thought. But something about the old man's calm confidence bothered him, like a small stone in his boot that he couldn't shake loose. The first rays of sunlight painted the valley floor golden as people from New Sol made their way to the flat clearing Kim Tae had suggested. Word had spread quickly through the small colony about the upcoming duel, and despite the early hour, nearly everyone had come to watch. They climbed the rocky slopes surrounding the valley, finding spots where they could see clearly while staying well out of harm's way. Parents held their children close, whispering warnings to stay quiet and still. Most of the colonists had never seen real combat before. They were miners, farmers, shopkeepers, and engineers who had come to this distant world seeking peaceful lives far from the conflicts that plagued other parts of human space. The idea of watching their elderly noodle shop owner fight an alien warrior seemed like something from a bad dream. Many had tried to talk Kim Tae out of this madness the night before, but the old man had just smiled and told them not to worry. Vexthor arrived like a walking storm cloud. His battle armor had changed overnight from the simple crystalline covering to something far more impressive and terrifying. Plates of what looked like living metal flowed across his body, shifting and adjusting with each movement. 4 swords hung from his back, but these were not the ceremonial blades from yesterday. These weapons hummed with barely contained energy, their edges crackling with power that made the air itself shimmer around them. The alien warrior had painted ritual, markings across his face in deep blue and silver, symbols that told the story of his victories and honored his ancestors. His forearms moved independently as he stretched and prepared, each limb seeming to have its own intelligence. When he walked, the ground beneath his feet left small scorch marks from the energy radiating off his weapons. In sharp contrast, Kim Tae approached the clearing looking like he was heading out for his morning walk. He wore the same simple clothes he always did, comfortable pants and a plain shirt that had seen many washings. The only weapon he carried was an old sword in a worn leather sheath, the kind of blade that might have been made centuries ago on Earth. The metal looked dull and ordinary next to the alien's energy weapons, like comparing a candle to lightning. Vexthor began his pre-combat ritual and the watching colonists fell completely silent. What they witnessed was unlike anything they had ever imagined possible. The alien moved through combat forms that seemed to defy the laws of physics, his 4 arms creating patterns of death that looked like a deadly dance. Each sword moved independently but in perfect harmony with the others, creating a web of strikes that could attack from every angle simultaneously. The warrior demonstrated techniques designed specifically to fight humans. He had studied their anatomy, their reflexes, their limitations. His movements exploited the fact that humans had only 2 arms, only 2 legs, only eyes in the front of their heads. He showed strikes that came from impossible angles, attacks that a 2-armed opponent could never hope to block. The display was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, like watching a hurricane made of blades. While this incredible demonstration continued, Kim Tae sat comfortably on a large rock at the edge of the clearing. He had brought a thermos of tea and occasionally took small sips while watching the alien's performance. Sometimes he glanced at his old digital wristwatch, the kind that miners wore because it could survive rough conditions. He seemed more interested in the time than in the deadly spectacle happening just yards away from him. The contrast was so stark that some colonists began to whisper among themselves. Had the old man lost his mind? Did he not understand what he was about to face? This alien warrior was demonstrating the ability to kill a human in dozens of different ways, and their representative was sitting there drinking tea like he was waiting for a bus. When Vexthor completed his ritual, sweat glistening on his crystalline skin despite the cool morning air, he turned to face the human. The alien's breathing was controlled but deep, his 4 hearts pumping energy through his powerful frame. He looked at Kim Tae with a mixture of confusion and growing irritation. The old man had not moved from his rock. He had not drawn his weapon. He had not performed any warm-up exercises or combat preparations. He had simply sat there, watching and occasionally checking the time. To Vexthor, this seemed like either madness or the most profound disrespect he had ever encountered. Unable to contain his frustration any longer, the alien warrior demanded an explanation. Why was this human showing no fear? Why was he not preparing for battle? Did he not understand that he was about to die? The questions came out in a rumbling roar that echoed off the valley walls and made several colonists take involuntary steps backward. Kim Tae finished his tea, screwed the cap back onto his thermos, and stood up slowly. His joints creaked slightly, the sound of a man who had lived a long life and felt every year of it. He looked at the towering alien warrior with calm, steady eyes and spoke in the same quiet voice he used when taking dinner orders. He said that some preparations did indeed take decades, but perhaps not the kind that Vexthor was expecting. The moment Kim Tae drew his ancient sword, Vexthor exploded, into motion like a force of nature unleashed. His 4 energy blades came alive simultaneously, creating a blazing whirlwind of death that filled the entire clearing. The attack was called the Kelthani Storm, and it had never failed to end a duel within the first few seconds. No creature, with only 2 arms, could possibly defend against strikes coming from 4 different directions at impossible speeds. The colonists watching from the slopes gasped in terror as the alien warrior became a blur of motion. His crystalline armor reflected the morning sunlight in dizzying patterns, while his energy weapons left trails of crackling power through the air. The sound was deafening, like standing inside thunder itself. 4 separate sword techniques merged into one overwhelming assault that should have cut any opponent into pieces before they could even react. But Kim Tae was not where the blades expected him to be. The old man moved like morning mist, seeming to drift between the deadly strikes, without any visible effort. A blade that should have taken his head passed through empty air as he bent slightly to one side. Another sword that targeted his heart found nothing but the space where he had been a split second before. He didn't make dramatic leaps or impossible acrobatic moves. Instead, he simply wasn't there when the attacks arrived. What looked like luck to the untrained eye was actually something far more impressive. Every movement Kim Tae made was perfectly calculated. He wasted no energy on unnecessary motion, took no steps that didn't serve a purpose. When he ducked under a high strike, he was already positioning himself to avoid the low cut that would follow. When he stepped left to dodge one blade, he was moving into the exact spot that would be safest from the other 3. Vexthor had studied human anatomy extensively. He knew exactly how fast human reflexes could work, how quickly their muscles could respond to danger. His attack patterns were designed to arrive faster than human nerves could carry warning signals to human brains. Yet somehow this elderly man was reacting to strikes before Vexthor had even fully committed to making them. The alien warrior's confidence, built up over 400 victories, began to develop tiny cracks. His first assault should have ended everything. The Kelthani Storm was not just an attack, it was a statement of absolute superiority. When it failed to connect even once, Vexthor felt something he had never experienced before in combat: doubt. He pressed his attack harder, adding techniques that exploited human blind spots. Humans could only look in one direction at a time, so he attacked from behind while striking from the front. But Kim Tae seemed to have eyes everywhere, moving away from threats he couldn't possibly have seen coming. The old man's footwork was extraordinary, each step placing him in the perfect position to avoid multiple attacks while setting up his escape from the next sequence. From the watching colonists' perspective, it looked like their elderly neighbor was dancing with death itself. The alien's weapons created a cage of energy around him, but somehow Kim Tae flowed through gaps that seemed too small to exist. His gray hair moved gently in the wind created by the passing blades, and his expression remained completely calm, as if he was taking a peaceful morning stroll instead of fighting for his life. Vexthor began to realize that his understanding of human capabilities had serious gaps. Everything his people had learned about these creatures came from fighting human soldiers in conventional warfare. But this man fought like no human in any Kelthani database. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of decades of training, not against other humans but against opponents who were faster, stronger, and better armed than himself. The alien's breathing became heavier as he poured more energy into his attacks. His 4 hearts were working overtime to fuel the incredible speed and precision required for his assault techniques. Sweat began to form on his crystalline skin, something that never happened during normal combat. Usually, his opponents were defeated so quickly that he barely had time to warm up. But Kim Tae looked like he could keep this up all day. The old man's breathing remained steady and controlled. He wasn't even sweating. More disturbing still, Vexthor began to notice that the human was learning his patterns. Each time the alien repeated a particular combination of strikes, Kim Tae's evasion became slightly more efficient, his positioning slightly more perfect. The most unsettling realization was that Kim Tae seemed to be reading his intentions before he fully formed them. The old man would begin moving away from an attack before Vexthor had even decided which blade to use. It was as if the human could see a few seconds into the future, or as if he understood something about Kelthani fighting techniques that even Vexthor didn't fully grasp. For the first time in his long warrior career, Vexthor began to suspect that he might not win this fight. The frustration building inside Vexthor was unlike anything he had ever experienced. In 400 duels across 12 conquered worlds, he had never encountered an opponent who could evade his attacks for more than a few seconds. Yet here was this frail-looking human, moving through his deadliest techniques like they were nothing more than a gentle breeze. The alien's forehearts were pounding with exertion and confusion as he began to understand that everything his people knew about human combat was dangerously wrong. The Kelthani Empire had built extensive databases on every species they encountered. Their military scholars had studied human anatomy, human reflexes, human fighting styles from thousands of recorded battles. They knew exactly how fast humans could move, how they balanced on two legs, where their weak points were located. Vexthor had memorized every detail, practiced against holographic human opponents, and perfected techniques specifically designed to exploit human limitations. But Kim Tae fought nothing like the humans in those records. Where the database said humans were slow, this old man moved with fluid grace that seemed to bend time itself. Where the record showed humans as clumsy and unbalanced, Kim Tae demonstrated footwork so precise it looked like he was following invisible lines drawn on the ground. Most disturbing of all, he fought like someone who had spent decades learning to survive against opponents who should have been able to kill him easily. Then something shifted in the old man's movement, so subtle that most of the watching colonists didn't even notice it. Kim Tae stopped purely evading and began what could only be called a counterattack, though it looked nothing like any aggressive assault Vexthor recognized. The ancient steel sword in the human's hands seemed to come alive, finding tiny gaps in the alien's defense that shouldn't have existed. The first strike came during a microsecond pause between two of Vexthor's blade combinations. Kim Tae's sword tip touched a joint seam in the crystalline armor where the alien's shoulder connected to his upper arm. It was barely more than a tap, but Vexthor felt a sharp jolt of pain shoot through his entire left side. The spot the human had touched was a nerve cluster that even Vexthor didn't know was vulnerable. His people's own anatomy texts had never mentioned it. The second strike targeted a pressure point behind Vexthor's lower right knee, a location that caused his leg to buckle momentarily. The alien warrior stumbled, his perfect balance disrupted for the first time in the fight. How could this human know weak spots in Kelthani anatomy that the Kelthani themselves had never discovered? Kim Tae's attacks continued with surgical precision. Each strike was minimal, using just enough force to achieve its purpose and no more. He wasn't trying to cause serious damage, but instead seemed to be systematically shutting down Vexthor's ability to fight effectively. A touch here disrupted the alien's grip on one sword. A tap there caused a muscle spasm that threw off his timing. Another precise strike numbed sensation in one of his arms. The old man's ancient blade found gaps in the energy field surrounding Vexthor's weapons, slipping through spaces that lasted for mere milliseconds. He struck at the exact moment when the alien's guard shifted between positions, timing his attacks to coincide with the natural rhythm of Vexthor's breathing. It was like watching a master musician play an incredibly complex piece, every note perfectly placed and timed. Vexthor realized with growing horror that he was being taken apart, piece by piece, by someone who understood his body better than he did himself. The human's knowledge wasn't theoretical, gained from books or computer simulations. This was practical, hard-won experience gained through actual combat against living Kelthani warriors. The watching colonists began to murmur in amazement as they witnessed something impossible. Their quiet neighbor, the man who served them noodle soup and asked about their families, was systematically defeating one of the galaxy's most feared warriors. Kim Tae moved like water flowing around rocks, always taking the path of least resistance but somehow always ending up exactly where he needed to be. As the fight continued, Vexthor's movements became less coordinated. The precise strikes to his nerve clusters were affecting his motor control, making his attacks clumsy and predictable. His four-blade storm was reduced to desperate, uncontrolled swinging as various muscle groups stopped responding properly to his commands. The most terrifying realization came when Vexthor understood that Kim Tae had been fighting aliens not for years, but for decades. The old man's techniques weren't adapted from human martial arts. They had been developed specifically for combat against non-human opponents. Every movement, every strike, every defensive position had been refined through actual life or death battles against creatures like himself. The alien warrior began to see his defeat approaching like an inevitable sunset. This wasn't just a duel anymore. It was a demonstration of just how much humanity had learned about fighting beings they were never supposed to be able to defeat. The end came not with violence, but with quiet acceptance. Vexthor's four energy blades lay scattered across the valley floor, their power cells drained and their deadly hum finally silenced. The massive alien warrior knelt on the dusty ground, his crystalline armor cracked in several places, his breathing heavy but steady. He was completely defeated, yet somehow completely unharmed. Not a single drop of his blue blood had been spilled, despite being thoroughly outmatched by an opponent he should have been able to crush without effort. Kim Tae approached slowly, his ancient sword already returned to its worn leather sheath. The old man moved carefully, not from injury, but from the natural caution of someone who had learned never to assume a fight was truly over until both parties agreed it was finished. He carried a small water bottle from his belt, the kind that miners use during long shifts underground, and offered it to the kneeling alien without saying a word. Vexthor looked up at the human with four eyes that held confusion, respect, and something that might have been relief. He accepted the water gratefully, his throat dry from exertion and shock. The liquid was cool and clean, tasting of nothing but purity. It was such a simple, human gesture of kindness that it almost brought tears to his alien eyes. The watching colonists began to descend from their rocky perches, drawn by curiosity and amazement. They moved quietly, almost reverently, as if they had just witnessed something sacred. Their elderly neighbor, the man who had served them countless bowls of soup and listened to their troubles with endless patience, had just accomplished something that seemed impossible. He had defeated a warrior from a race that had conquered 12 star systems through superior combat skills. Kim Tae sat down on the same rock where he had waited before the duel began, his movements showing the stiffness of a man who had pushed his aging body to its limits. He pulled out his thermos again and poured himself a small cup of tea, the steam rising gently in the morning air. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years and memories that most of the colonists had never suspected existed. He told them about his past, speaking in the same quiet, measured tone he used when discussing the weather or recommending soup specials. 35 years ago, he had served with the Colonial Defense Force during what historians now called the First Contact Wars. Back then, humanity had been young in the galaxy, naive and unprepared for the realities of interstellar conflict. They had encountered the Kelthani Empire when a raiding fleet attacked the outer colonies, seeking to expand their territory through their traditional method of single combat challenges. Kim Tae had been a young soldier then, barely 20 years, old and full of the confidence that came from being trained by Earth's best military instructors. He had volunteered to face a Kelthani champion in single combat, believing that human determination and skill could overcome any opponent. The alien warrior had nearly killed him in the first 30 seconds of their duel, teaching him a harsh lesson about the difference between training against humans and fighting creatures that evolution had designed for combat. But humans, Kim Tae explained, had one advantage that no other species in the galaxy seemed to possess in quite the same way. They could adapt. Where other races relied on their natural strengths and traditional techniques, humans could learn, change, and evolve their methods based on new information. After his defeat, Kim Tae had spent years studying captured Kelthani weapons, analyzing recordings of their fighting techniques and, most importantly, learning from every encounter with alien opponents. He had fought 17 more duels during the war, each one teaching him something new about non-human combat. He learned that winning wasn't about being stronger or faster than his opponents. It was about understanding them completely, knowing their capabilities better than they knew themselves, and finding ways to turn their advantages into weaknesses. Tighter. Old Master explained that the deadliest human warriors were not those who relied on superior physical abilities, because humans rarely had those. Instead, they were the ones who could study an opponent for years if necessary, learning every detail of their anatomy, psychology, and fighting style, then developing techniques specifically designed to exploit what they had learned. As Kim Tae spoke, Vexathor listened with growing understanding. The human had not simply defeated him through luck or hidden strength. This had been the result of decades of preparation, study, and practical experience gained through actual combat against his people. Every evasion, every counterattack, every precise strike had been the product of hard-won knowledge about Kelthani physiology and fighting methods. When the alien warrior finally stood to leave, his movements were slow and thoughtful. He had come to this remote colony expecting an easy victory that would add another world to his empire's collection. Instead, he was returning home with news that would shake the foundations of everything the Kelthani believed about human capabilities. As his transport ship lifted off from the dusty landing pad, Vexthor carried with him a new understanding of humanity's place in the galaxy. These creatures were not weak because they lacked natural weapons or armor. They were dangerous precisely because they could transform any weakness into strength, any disadvantage into opportunity, through the simple but powerful act of never stopping learning.